I was only 15 years old when this happened, and even now, years later, I can still remember every detail with terrifying clarity. There are nights when I wake up thinking about that house, that hallway, and the man whose smile never once disappeared. At 15, I was constantly searching for ways to earn a little extra money. I wasn't old enough to get most legal part-time jobs, so I relied on whatever work I could find. I mowed lawns, walked dogs, helped neighbors carry groceries, and occasionally babysat for local families. Most of those jobs came through people my parents already knew, making them feel relatively safe. Then, one afternoon during summer vacation while scrolling through Craigslist out of boredom, I came across an advertisement that immediately caught my attention. A woman was looking for an overnight babysitter. The listing explained that she worked late-night shifts and needed someone responsible to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, Rose. According to the description, Rose would already be asleep before the babysitter arrived and almost certainly wouldn't wake up until morning. The job sounded incredibly easy. All I really had to do was remain in the house while the little girl slept. The pay, however, was what truly surprised me. It was nearly double what I usually earn for babysitting. At first, I wondered if it was too good to be true. Still, I emailed the address listed in the advertisement. Less than an hour later, I received a reply asking for my phone number. That evening, the woman called me. Her voice was calm, polite, and reassuring. She sounded like any hard-working single mother trying to balance life and parenthood. She patiently answered every question I asked. Because her work shift started before I was scheduled to arrive, she explained that she wouldn't be home to let me in. Instead, she would hide a spare key outside the front porch and told me the exact location where I could find it. Everything sounded perfectly reasonable. Since I was only 15, my mother insisted on speaking with the woman herself before allowing me to accept the job. The two of them talked for several minutes. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but afterward my mother smiled and told me the woman seemed trustworthy and pleasant. Whatever concerns she had were apparently put to rest. The babysitting job was scheduled for the following evening, around 9:30 p.m. My mom drove me to the address. The farther we traveled from our neighborhood, the quieter everything became. Eventually, we turned onto a narrow residential street lined with enormous oak trees whose branches stretched over the road like skeletal fingers. The house sat near the very end of a dead-end street. There were no pedestrians, no barking dogs, no neighbors sitting on their porches. The entire area felt strangely lifeless. As we pulled into the driveway, one thing immediately caught my attention. Every single light inside the house was turned on, not just the porch light. Every room glowed brightly behind the curtains. It was unusual, but I convinced myself the woman simply wanted me to feel comfortable arriving alone at night. My mother waited in the driveway while I walked toward the porch. Exactly where the woman had described beneath a decorative flower pot sat the spare key. I unlocked the front door. The moment I stepped inside, a strange silence swallowed me. Not ordinary silence. It was the kind that almost felt alive. The kind that made you instinctively lower your voice even though nobody had told you to. I placed my backpack beside the couch and turned around to wave goodbye as my mother's car slowly disappeared down the street. The headlights vanished around the corner. Now I was completely alone. Or at least, I believed I was. The house looked perfectly normal. Family photographs decorated the walls. A few stuffed animals rested beside the living room sofa. A small pink backpack leaned against a dining chair. The refrigerator was covered with children's drawings held up by colorful magnets. Everything appeared exactly as I would expect in the home of a young child. Still, I wanted to familiarize myself with the layout before settling in. I slowly walked through the first floor. The kitchen opened into a narrow hallway leading towards several bedrooms. The hallway lights were on, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. As I reached the first open doorway on my right, I casually glanced inside. Then, my entire body froze. Someone was standing in the room. A man. He stood perfectly still beside the window. His back faced me. He appeared to be staring outside into the darkness. Except there was absolutely nothing outside. The backyard was pitch black. No streetlights. No movement. Nothing worth watching. Yet he remained completely motionless, as if fascinated by something hidden within the darkness. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me that something wasn't right. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "Hello." The instant my voice broke the silence, he slowly turned around. The first thing I noticed wasn't his face. It was his smile. A wide, unnaturally wide, completely expressionless smile. Then I noticed something else. One of his front teeth was missing. The empty gap somehow made his smile look even more disturbing. I asked him who he was. He didn't answer. Not a single word. He simply continued staring directly at me while wearing that exact same smile. My heart immediately began pounding. Without taking my eyes off him, I backed away into the hallway and quickly pulled out my phone. My hands were already shaking as I dialed the woman's number. She answered after several rings. Trying to keep my voice steady, I explained that there was a man inside one of the bedrooms. For a brief moment, she sounded genuinely confused. There was a pause. Then, almost as though she had suddenly remembered something she should have mentioned much earlier, her tone changed. "Oh, that's just my brother." Another pause. "He has dementia." She casually explained that he sometimes wandered through the house during the night and occasionally stood near the windows. "Don't worry," she said with a light laugh. "He's completely harmless." Her explanation didn't comfort me in the slightest. In fact, it made everything worse. If another adult was living in the house, especially someone suffering from dementia, why hadn't she mentioned him in the advertisement? Why hadn't she told either me or my mother during our conversations? That wasn't a small detail someone simply forgot. Before ending the call, she told me to help myself to anything in the refrigerator and reminded me that I could sleep in the guest bedroom located at the very end of the hallway. Then she hung up. I remained standing there for almost a full minute, phone still in my hand, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe she really had forgotten. Maybe the man truly was harmless. Maybe everything was perfectly normal. I wanted to believe that, so I continued exploring the hallway. The bedroom where I'd first seen the man remained open, but now it was empty. He had disappeared. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard a door close. He was simply gone. An uneasy feeling settled deep in my stomach. Trying to stay calm, I continued farther down the hallway. Besides the guest room, there were 4 other doors. Curiosity got the better of me. I tried the first door. Locked. The second. Locked. The third. Also locked. The 4th door opened only a few inches before something stopped it. I peered through the narrow opening. The room beyond was dark, completely empty. No furniture. No decorations. Nothing. After pushing the door slightly farther, I realized there was nothing inside at all. Just an abandoned room collecting dust. Embarrassed by how frightened I'd become, I headed toward the guest bedroom. As I passed through the kitchen again, something suddenly caught my eye. The drawings on the refrigerator. I hadn't paid much attention before. Now I looked closer. The paper wasn't fresh. It had yellowed with age. The corners curled inward. A thin layer of dust rested on top of several magnets. The pink backpack I'd noticed earlier also looked faded, almost sun-bleached. It didn't look like something a 6-year-old currently used. It looked forgotten, almost preserved. A cold realization slowly crept into my mind. When was the last time a child had actually lived in this house? Up until that moment, I'd been inside nearly 30 minutes, yet I hadn't heard a single sound from Rose. No footsteps, no breathing, no cartoons, no toys scattered across the floor, no bedroom decorated for a little girl. Nothing. The entire house felt like someone had carefully staged the appearance of a family, without an actual family living there. That thought sent chills racing across my skin. Finally, I reached the guest room. It was small, neat, and surprisingly empty. I placed my backpack beside the bed. As I turned toward the door, another unsettling detail caught my attention. There was no lock, not even a place where one had once existed. A strange feeling urged me to look back into the hallway. Slowly, I did, and my blood instantly ran cold. He was there again, standing at the opposite end of the hallway, perfectly still, watching me. I had never heard him approach, never heard footsteps, never heard a door open. It was as though he had simply appeared the moment I looked away. Then that smile slowly spread across his face again. The gap where his front tooth should have been looked even darker beneath the hallway lights. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at one another across the long hallway. Every instinct inside me screamed to run, yet somehow I couldn't move. It no longer felt like I was looking at a confused elderly man suffering from dementia. It felt like I was staring into the eyes of someone patiently waiting for me to make the next move. Without taking my eyes off the hallway, I stepped backward into the guest room and quietly pushed the door shut. The soft click of the latch echoed through the silent house. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to breathe. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed, pressing both hands against my knees to stop them from shaking. My pulse pounded so violently that I could hear it inside my ears. I kept replaying everything that had happened. The man, his impossible smile, the missing front tooth, the way he seemed to appear wherever I looked without making the slightest sound. I wasn't unfamiliar with dementia. My great-grandmother had suffered from it before she passed away, so I understood how unpredictable people with the condition could become. They wandered. They forgot where they were. Sometimes they stared into space or repeated strange behaviors. I wanted to believe that was all this was. I desperately wanted a logical explanation, but something deep inside me refused to accept it. This wasn't simply an elderly man wandering through his own home. Nothing about the atmosphere in that house felt normal. Nothing. Trying to steady my breathing, I grabbed my phone and called my mom. Once, no answer. Twice, still nothing. By the third attempt, she finally picked up. The moment I heard her voice, every ounce of courage I'd been forcing myself to hold together nearly disappeared. I told her everything. About the man who had never been mentioned before I accepted the job. About the strange explanation the woman had casually offered afterward. About the locked bedrooms. About the faded backpack. About the yellowed children's drawings that looked years old. And finally, about the little girl I was supposedly babysitting. I had been inside that house for nearly half an hour, yet I hadn't heard a single sound. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Not a toilet flushing. Not a child turning over in bed. Nothing. When I finished speaking, my mother remained silent, long enough that I wondered whether the call had disconnected. Then she spoke in a calm but unusually firm voice. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. Right now." Hearing those words should have comforted me. Instead, they terrified me. Because if my mother, who almost never overreacted, believed something was seriously wrong, then maybe I wasn't imagining any of this. She ended the call, promising she would drive as fast as she safely could. Now, all I had to do was wait. Those next few minutes felt longer than the rest of the night combined. The house remained unnaturally still. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured. Each step echoed softly against the wooden floor outside my room. One, then another, then another. The sound grew closer. Every muscle in my body locked in place. I didn't dare breathe. The footsteps finally stopped directly outside my door. Silence. Absolute silence. I stared at the doorknob without blinking. Whoever stood outside wasn't moving. They weren't knocking. They weren't speaking. They were simply standing there, listening, waiting. I glanced at my phone. No new messages. No missed calls. The woman hadn't contacted me once to ask how things were going. If she truly cared about her daughter being watched by a teenage babysitter, wouldn't she have checked in by now? Trying to convince myself everything still had a rational explanation, I called her. The phone rang. No answer. I called again. Nothing. A third time. Straight to voicemail. That was when I felt the first wave of genuine panic. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked, ever so slowly. It opened just a few inches. I froze. The gap wasn't wide enough for me to see into the hallway. All I could see was darkness beyond the crack. Whoever had opened it remained completely hidden. No hand. No face. No shadow. Nothing. The door simply stayed there, partially open, as though someone stood inches away from it, watching, waiting for me to make the first move. Every instinct screamed that it had to be the woman's brother. Yet something about the silence made that explanation harder and harder to believe. Several endless seconds passed. No movement. No words. Only the faint sound of my own heartbeat. That was the moment I decided I wasn't waiting any longer. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I didn't care if I lost the job. I just wanted out. Quietly, I slipped off the bed and moved toward the window. It resisted at first. My heart nearly stopped as it squeaked against the frame. I paused. Nothing happened. Slowly, I forced it open just wide enough to squeeze through. The cool night air hit my face. Without another thought, I climbed onto the windowsill and dropped into the backyard. I landed awkwardly in the grass, stumbled forward, caught myself, and immediately started running. I never looked back. Branches slapped against my arms. My shoes pounded across the uneven ground. I reached the sidewalk, crossed the street, and kept running until I was nearly an entire block away from the house. Only then did I finally slow down enough to catch my breath. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to call my mom again. Before I could dial, my phone vibrated. A text message from the woman. There were only 4 words. "Where are you going?" Every hair on my body stood upright. I slowly turned around. The house sat quietly beneath the streetlights. No one stood outside. No curtains moved. No lights flickered. No one was visible in any window. And yet, she somehow knew I'd left. I hadn't noticed security cameras. She wasn't home. No neighbors were outside. So how could she possibly know? At that exact moment, every remaining doubt disappeared. Whatever had been happening inside that house, I wanted absolutely no part of it. I immediately called my mother again. This time I begged her not to pull into the driveway. Instead, I told her to meet me farther down the street where the house was no longer visible. About 10 agonizing minutes later, her headlights appeared around the corner. The instant she stopped, I yanked open the passenger door, jumped inside, slammed it shut, and locked it before she even had time to ask questions. Neither of us looked back. She drove away without hesitation. We never contacted the woman again. She never contacted us again either. To this day, I still don't know who that smiling man really was. I don't know whether Rose ever existed. I don't know why every bedroom except the guest room was locked, and I certainly don't know how that woman knew I'd climbed out of the bedroom window. Every now and then I try convincing myself that maybe I panicked over nothing. Maybe there truly was a harmless man suffering from dementia. Maybe Rose had simply slept through everything. Maybe fear caused my imagination to fill in the blanks. But every time I replay that night in my head, I come to the same conclusion. Something inside that house wasn't right, and leaving when I did may have been the smartest decision I've ever made. A few months later, another strange experience found me. This one didn't involve babysitting. Instead, it happened during my very first summer job. I was 15, maybe 16, and had been hired to help clean vacant apartments inside a run-down, low-income housing complex. The property manager, someone I had known for years because I used to babysit for her children, offered me the position. For a teenager, the pay was surprisingly generous. The work itself sounded simple enough. Whenever a family moved out, our job was to clean the apartment thoroughly before new tenants arrived. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. In reality, many apartments looked less like homes people had moved out of, and more like places people had fled. Entire wardrobes remained hanging in closets. Family photographs still covered the walls. Half-eaten food sometimes sat forgotten inside refrigerators. Children's toys remained scattered across bedroom floors. There were occasions when it honestly looked as though the occupants had stood up in the middle of an ordinary day and never returned. One afternoon, I was assigned to work with a university student I'll call Jen. She was around 20 or 21, confident, experienced, and naturally took charge while I followed her instructions. That day, our assignment was a townhouse located at the very end of a long row of connected units. The layout of the place would later become important. The moment you stepped through the front door, you entered a modest living room. Immediately to the right stood two separate staircases. One led upstairs to the bedrooms. The other, hidden behind a plain wooden door, descended into the basement. The basement stairs turned sharply twice before reaching the bottom, making it impossible to see the basement from the main floor. Once downstairs, there was only a single unfinished concrete room, a washing machine, a dryer, a furnace humming quietly in the corner, one lonely light bulb hanging from the ceiling. No closets, no storage rooms, no hidden spaces, no place where anyone could conceal themselves, or so we believed. The moment we stepped inside the townhouse, it became obvious the previous tenants had left in extraordinary haste. The kitchen counters were still covered with dirty dishes. Cabinets stood open. Clothes were scattered throughout the bedrooms. Boxes had been started but never finished. It felt less like moving, and more like escaping. For the first several hours, Jen and I filled garbage bag after garbage bag, separating usable belongings from trash, while trying not to wonder what had caused an entire family to abandon nearly everything they owned. Only after the apartment had finally been cleared did we begin the actual cleaning. Neither of us had the slightest idea that the strangest part of the day was still waiting for us beneath the house. Once the apartment had been emptied of abandoned belongings, we finally moved on to the deep cleaning. That was when the strange things began. One of our routine tasks involved pulling every major appliance away from the walls. The refrigerator, the oven, even the washing machine had to be moved so we could scrub away years of accumulated grease, dust, and grime hidden behind them. It was unpleasant work, but after cleaning dozens of vacant units, we'd gotten used to it. The oven was especially filthy. After dragging it away from the wall, we spent nearly 20 minutes scraping away layers of burnt food and sticky grease that had hardened over time. When we finished, all that remained was the storage drawer beneath the oven. We pulled it completely out so we could clean underneath. Only then did we discover that both metal rails had been bent. When we tried sliding the drawer back into place, it refused to cooperate. We pushed. Nothing. We lifted it slightly and tried again. Still nothing. Eventually, Jen stood on one side while I stood on the other, and we both began kicking the drawer with the heels of our shoes. Each kick produced a loud metallic clang that echoed through the empty townhouse. Finally, with one particularly hard shove, the drawer slammed into place beneath the oven. There, Jen laughed. Not our problem anymore. Curious, I grabbed the handle and gave it a firm pull. It didn't move even a fraction of an inch. It had wedged itself so tightly into the frame that it might as well have been welded there. Neither of us planned on touching it again. Satisfied, we split up to finish the remaining work. Jen headed upstairs to clean the bedrooms and bathroom while I stayed downstairs to watch the glass light fixtures from the living room ceiling. The apartment became strangely quiet once we separated. The only sounds were the occasional scrape of my ladder across the hardwood floor and the distant humming of the refrigerator. I had just climbed onto the ladder when I heard it. Someone called my name. It came from upstairs. The voice wasn't loud. It was calm, almost casual, just loud enough to sound like Jen asking for help. I immediately called back, "What?" Silence. No answer. Assuming she hadn't heard me, I climbed down and walked upstairs. I eventually found Jen inside one of the bedrooms. She was vacuuming with large headphones covering both ears. She didn't even notice me until I tapped her shoulder. She pulled one earphone aside. "What? You called me." Her forehead wrinkled with confusion. "I didn't." "I heard you." She laughed softly. "No, you didn't." She lifted the headphones slightly. "I've been listening to music the whole time." I stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the noise from another apartment had echoed strangely through the building. Trying not to overthink it, I returned downstairs. There was one part of that townhouse I had disliked from the moment we entered: the attic access. It was located directly above the staircase. Normally, these openings were covered with a removable wooden panel. This one wasn't. Instead, there was only a perfect black square cut into the ceiling. Every time I walked beneath it, I instinctively looked upward. Nothing could be seen inside. The crawlspace swallowed every bit of light. It looked less like an attic, and more like a hole leading into endless darkness. I hated passing beneath it. A few minutes later, I heard my name again. Exactly the same voice. Exactly the same tone. This time, before I even had a chance to climb the stairs, Jen shouted from upstairs, "I didn't call you." Then after a brief pause, she added with an awkward laugh, "You're hearing things." At the time, I actually believed she was right. It was strange. Uncomfortable. But not terrifying. Not yet. I tried focusing on my work. The light fixtures were covered in years of dust and nicotine stains, so I carried each glass cover to the kitchen sink to wash them individually. While scrubbing one beneath running water, I turned around to grab a clean sponge. The instant I stepped backward, I nearly fell over. The oven drawer was sticking halfway out onto the kitchen floor. I froze. That wasn't possible. Jen and I had practically beaten the thing into submission only 20 minutes earlier. We had both confirmed afterward that it couldn't even be pulled open. Yet here it was, halfway extended, waiting. I stared at it for several long seconds. Eventually, assuming I must have imagined how tightly it had been wedged, I walked over and kicked it back into place. It took several solid kicks before it finally slammed underneath the oven again. To be absolutely certain, I grabbed the handle with both hands and pulled as hard as I could. Nothing. Completely stuck. Satisfied, I returned to the sink. Maybe 5 minutes passed. Maybe less. When I turned around again, my stomach dropped. The drawer was back out. Exactly as before, halfway open. Perfectly still. I hadn't heard metal scraping. I hadn't heard it slide. I hadn't heard footsteps. Jen was still upstairs. I knew because I could hear the vacuum cleaner running overhead. This time I didn't touch the drawer. I simply stared at it. Logic couldn't explain what I was looking at. That drawer hadn't accidentally rolled open. It couldn't have. It had been jammed into place with enough force that two people couldn't pull it loose. I slowly backed away. If it wants to stay open, I muttered to myself, then it can stay open. From that moment on, it officially became someone else's problem. Trying to distract myself, I resumed reinstalling the freshly cleaned light fixtures. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, making the room bright enough that I switched the living room lights off while balancing on the ladder. I was holding one of the heavy glass covers above my head, carefully aligning the screws when something happened that I still cannot explain. Click. The ceiling light exploded to life. The sudden brightness blinded me. I jerked instinctively. The ladder wobbled. My foot slipped. I fell backward. At the exact same moment, the glass fixture slipped from my hands. It crashed onto the hardwood floor beside my head. The explosion of shattered glass echoed throughout the apartment. For several seconds, I simply lay there, too stunned to move. Then I looked toward the wall, the light switch. It was clearly in the on position. No one stood anywhere near it. No one. At the same time, I could still hear Jen walking around upstairs. The footsteps never stopped. Only a few seconds had passed since the light came on. There was absolutely no way she could have sprinted downstairs, flipped the switch, and returned upstairs without me seeing or hearing her. The light had turned on by itself. At least, that was the only explanation left. Even then, I refused to think about ghosts. I searched desperately for a logical reason, faulty wiring, loose electrical contacts, anything. But none of those explanations made the switch physically move. The uneasy feeling I'd been ignoring all afternoon suddenly became impossible to shake. I climbed upstairs to find Jen. She immediately noticed the expression on my face. What happened? I explained everything. The drawer, the light, the broken fixture. As I spoke, the color slowly drained from her face. When I finished, she hesitated before quietly saying something that made my blood run cold. I didn't want to tell you earlier. She glanced toward the hallway, because I thought I was imagining it. I waited. Then she continued. A few minutes ago, I heard someone call my name. It wasn't you. Silence filled the room. Neither of us laughed. Neither of us tried explaining it away anymore. For the first time that day, we both admitted the same thing. Something inside that apartment didn't feel right. Fortunately, there was only one task remaining, sweeping the basement. Unfortunately, neither of us wanted to go down there alone. Without even discussing it, we grabbed our brooms and descended the narrow staircase together. The basement looked exactly as it had when we first arrived. A single, unfinished concrete room, a washing machine against one wall, a dryer beside it, the furnace humming quietly in the corner, one lonely light bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across the bare floor. There were no storage rooms, no closets, no crawl spaces, no furniture, no hiding places. If anyone or anything was down there, we would see it immediately. Or at least, that's what we believed as we stepped off the final stair into the suffocating silence below. While Jen swept the concrete floor, I climbed onto the old dryer and sat there talking with her. Neither of us admitted it out loud, but we were both eager to finish. The basement felt strangely oppressive. It wasn't frightening because of what we could see. It was frightening because of what we couldn't. The unfinished concrete walls seemed to absorb every sound except our own voices. The furnace emitted a low mechanical hum that never changed in volume, while the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling swayed, almost imperceptibly, casting slow-moving shadows across the bare floor. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. No storage closets, no crawl spaces, no furniture, no stacked boxes, nothing. Just one empty room. That fact should have been comforting. Instead, it somehow made the place feel even more unsettling. After several minutes, Jen finished sweeping the last corner of the basement. Done, she sighed. Neither of us lingered. We climbed the narrow staircase together, relieved to leave the basement behind. Back upstairs, we began gathering our cleaning supplies scattered throughout the living room. Buckets, spray bottles, rags, trash bags. I remember thinking we were finally finished. Another 5 minutes and we'd be driving home. I was standing only a couple of feet away from the open basement door, coiling an extension cord when everything changed. At first, there was only silence. Then, a sound echoed upward from the darkness below. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Not faint. Not distant. Loud, solid, deliberate. Jen stopped moving immediately. So did I. We looked at one another without saying a word. Neither of us needed to ask if the other had heard it. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking around in the basement. My first thought was impossible. There couldn't be anyone down there. We had both been in the basement only seconds earlier. It had been completely empty. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed somehow felt even worse. For one brief second, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the furnace had shifted. Maybe old pipes were expanding. Maybe the building was settling. Then, bang, bang, bang. The footsteps exploded into a sprint. Whoever was below us was no longer walking. They were running. Running full speed. Straight toward the staircase. The pounding grew louder with terrifying speed. Each impact shook the wooden steps. The sound echoed violently through the stairwell. It wasn't wandering. It wasn't random. It was charging directly toward us. Every instinct in my body screamed the same command. Run, I looked at Jen. Every trace of color had disappeared from her face. Her eyes were impossibly wide. She had heard exactly what I had. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't time. Without thinking, I lunged toward the basement door. Just as the pounding reached what sounded like the middle of the staircase, I grabbed the doorknob with both hands and slammed the heavy wooden door shut with every ounce of strength I had. The crash echoed throughout the townhouse. I didn't wait to hear what happened next. Neither did Jen. We bolted. Cleaning supplies were abandoned where they lay. Buckets tipped over. A broom clattered across the floor behind us. We burst through the front door so hard that it slammed against the outside wall. Then we ran. Across the front lawn, across the parking area, past several neighboring units. Neither of us looked back. Halfway across the complex, I heard Jen shouting behind me. The key. I realized we had left it inside. Without slowing down, I yelled over my shoulder, "Forget it." Nothing inside that townhouse was worth going back for. We didn't stop running until the building was barely visible in the distance. Only then did we finally slow down, both bent over trying to catch our breath. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. We didn't need to. The expressions on our faces said everything. Eventually, we made our way back to the property manager's office. Trying to sound as normal as possible, we told her we believed someone had been inside the vacant townhouse. That was technically true. At least, that's what we wanted to believe. We explained that we had left our cleaning supplies behind and refused to go back inside. To her credit, she didn't argue. As far as I know, she contacted the police before allowing anyone else to enter the unit. She asked us several questions. Did we see anyone? Did someone threaten us? Was anything stolen? Jen and I exchanged nervous glances. How could we possibly explain what had actually happened? That we'd spent the afternoon hearing invisible voices calling our names. That a jammed oven drawer somehow kept sliding itself open. That a light switch appeared to move on its own. That footsteps had raced up an empty basement staircase where no human being could possibly have been hiding. It sounded absurd, so we kept most of it to ourselves. Years have passed since that day. I've experienced other strange things in my life. Most of them probably have reasonable explanations. I'm naturally skeptical. I don't automatically assume every unexplained event is supernatural. Maybe our minds played tricks on us. Maybe the voices were echoes from another apartment. Maybe the oven drawer shifted because of uneven flooring. Maybe faulty wiring somehow caused the light switch to behave strangely. I've considered every possibility, over and over. But one detail has never fit any logical explanation. The basement. We had both been down there, together. Only moments earlier. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. Absolutely nowhere. Yet the footsteps that came charging toward us weren't vague sounds echoing through the building. They weren't distant noises from another unit. They sounded exactly like someone sprinting up those wooden stairs, coming directly for us. Even now, more than 20 years later, hearing heavy footsteps running up a staircase instantly takes me back to that summer afternoon, to the basement, to the empty room, to the sound of something that should never have been there. I've remained skeptical all my life, but I've never been able to explain what happened inside that townhouse. Long before that experience, I had already developed a reputation among my family as someone who was always chasing the next opportunity to earn money. I hated sitting still. If there was a way to make a few extra dollars, I wanted to find it. One summer, my mother mentioned that an elderly couple from her church needed temporary help around their property. Their names were Richard and Elaine. They were both somewhere in their late 60s. Old enough to need assistance with physically demanding work, but still healthy enough to manage most things themselves. They lived nearly 40 minutes from our house, deep in a quiet rural area where houses became fewer and farther apart the longer you drove. The final stretch of road wound through endless farmland before narrowing into a lonely gravel lane lined with towering pine trees. At the very end of that lane stood their home, an aging farmhouse that looked as though it had been watching over those fields for generations. The arrangement was simple. I would stay with them for a little over a week. During the day, I'd help Richard with whatever jobs he could no longer do comfortably on his own, cleaning out the garage, painting sections of the old wooden fence, moving heavy furniture, cutting overgrown brush, repairing small things around the property. At the end of the week, they would pay me. It sounded like easy money. My mother had known Richard for years through church, so she trusted both him and his wife completely. The first time I met Elaine, she immediately reminded me of the kind grandmother everyone wished they had. She spoke softly. She smiled almost constantly. Every few minutes she asked whether I was hungry or needed something to drink. Richard was quieter, a hard-working man whose weathered hands and sunburned face reflected decades of farm work. Nothing about either of them seemed unusual. The farmhouse itself was exactly what I expected from an elderly couple living miles away from town. Old wooden floors that creaked with every step, family photographs covering nearly every wall, antique furniture polished from years of careful use. The comforting scent of old books, fresh coffee, and cedar wood drifted through the house. At first glance, it felt like one of the safest places imaginable. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether that's exactly why I never saw the warning signs until it was far too late. The guest room where I would be staying was located at the very end of the second-floor hallway. It was a small bedroom with faded floral wallpaper, a narrow wooden bed, a dresser that looked older than I was, and a single window overlooking the woods behind the farmhouse. During the day, the room seemed perfectly ordinary. Sunlight poured through the curtains, birds chirped outside, and the breeze carried the scent of pine trees into the room. At night, it became a completely different place. On my first day, Richard spent several hours showing me around the property. We walked through the barns, the tool shed, the fenced pasture, and the overgrown gardens that needed attention. As we worked, he gave me a long list of projects we'd tackle over the next week: repairing fence posts, organizing the garage, clearing brush, painting sections of the old fence, and moving decades' worth of forgotten equipment. Meanwhile, Elaine stayed inside preparing dinner. When we finally sat down to eat, I noticed something unusual about her. She barely spoke. Whenever she wasn't eating, she simply watched us with a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. It wasn't an unfriendly smile. It was simply empty, almost automatic. During dinner, she asked me my name. I smiled and introduced myself. A few minutes later, she asked again. I assumed she hadn't heard me. Then, before the meal was over, she asked a third time. Richard gently chuckled and placed his hand over hers. "She forgets things sometimes," he said casually. I nodded. To me, it sounded like ordinary, age-related forgetfulness. My own grandparents occasionally repeated questions. I didn't think much of it. That night, after talking with Richard for a while in the living room, I headed upstairs around 11 o'clock. The farmhouse had become incredibly quiet. The silence out there was unlike anything I'd experienced growing up in town. No traffic. No distant sirens. No neighbors. Only the occasional chirping of insects outside the windows and the soft creaking of the old house settling into the night. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, sometime around 3 in the morning. I woke abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. Creak, creak, creak. Footsteps. Someone was walking in the hallway. The old wooden floorboards groaned beneath each step. At first, I assumed Richard had gotten up to use the bathroom. That seemed perfectly reasonable. But after several moments, the footsteps didn't stop. They passed my door, continued toward the end of the hallway, paused, then slowly returned, back past my room. A few seconds later, they repeated the exact same path, back and forth, over and over again. I lay perfectly still beneath the blankets, staring into the darkness. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The pacing never stopped. Whoever was outside wasn't heading anywhere. They were simply walking the hallway, as though waiting, listening, thinking. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, directly outside my bedroom door. Every muscle in my body tightened. My eyes drifted toward the narrow gap beneath the door. For several seconds, nothing. Then I noticed two dark shapes blocking the faint moonlight coming from the hallway window. Someone was standing immediately outside my room, not moving, not speaking, just standing there, watching the closed door. I couldn't breathe. My heartbeat became so loud I was convinced whoever stood outside could hear it. Finally, the shadow shifted. The footsteps slowly resumed. They moved farther down the hallway until the floorboards gradually fell silent. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. The following morning, while Richard and I repaired sections of the fence, I casually mentioned hearing someone pacing outside my room. He didn't appear surprised, not even slightly. Instead, he smiled with tired understanding. That was probably Elaine. He explained that she sometimes wandered the house after bad dreams. Occasionally, she became confused about where she was. It happens more often than either of us would like. His tone sounded practiced, as though he'd explained it many times before. Trying to make light of the situation, I asked if I should lock my bedroom door at night. Richard laughed softly. "The guest room doesn't even have a lock." He shrugged. "This old house wasn't built with much privacy in mind." I laughed too, but inside, I wasn't amused. The second night proved even worse. Again, I woke sometime after midnight. Again, footsteps. Only this time they moved much faster. The pacing felt restless, uneven, almost frantic. Between the creaking floorboards, I heard something else. A voice. Elaine was whispering to herself. At first, I couldn't understand the words. They blended together into a quiet stream of unintelligible murmuring. Then I heard my name, clearly, distinctly. She said it only once, but that single word sent a wave of goosebumps across my entire body. I stared toward the bottom of the door. Her shadow passed underneath it again. Once, twice, 3 times. Each pass slower than the last. By now, I'd begun to hate the unusually large gap beneath that old bedroom door. It felt like an invitation, as if the darkness itself were peering inside. Then the doorknob moved. Slowly. The metal clicked as it twisted. The door eased open about an inch. Only an inch. The hallway beyond remained almost completely black. Through the narrow opening came the sound of whispering. Soft, barely audible. I strained to hear. The words remained impossible to understand. Whoever stood outside never entered. After several agonizing seconds, the whispering stopped. The door slowly drifted closed again. Click. Silence returned. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much after that. The following morning I described everything to Richard in detail. The pacing, the whispering, the door opening. His expression briefly darkened before he forced another reassuring smile. She probably thought the room was empty. He sighed. She's been doing things like that more lately. Then he looked at me almost apologetically. It embarrasses her. If you don't mind, please don't mention it around Elaine. I agreed. During the daytime, she seemed almost completely normal. She prepared lunch, folded laundry, watered flowers, read magazines in the living room. Anyone visiting during daylight hours would probably think she was simply a quiet, elderly woman. Yet every so often, I'd look up unexpectedly and catch her staring at me, not smiling, not blinking, just watching. Her expression completely blank. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't fear. It was something harder to describe, almost as though she couldn't decide whether she recognized me or whether I belonged inside the house at all. Each time our eyes met, she'd quietly look away and continue whatever she had been doing. By the fourth day, I started noticing other things around the property. Richard and I spent most of the afternoon cleaning an old storage shed behind the farmhouse. While sorting through decades of forgotten junk, I noticed a dented aluminum walker shoved behind several heavy boxes. It looked badly damaged. One leg was bent inward. Nearby sat a broken picture frame. The glass had shattered long ago. Dark brown stains had dried across one corner. At first glance, I assumed it was old rust, but something about the color bothered me. Richard quietly tossed both items into a trash pile without saying a word. Later that afternoon, I went inside to wash up. As I walked down the upstairs hallway, something caught my attention. A long gouge stretched across one wall at about chest height. The paint had been scraped completely away. It looked as though something heavy had been violently dragged along the hallway. Downstairs, I noticed another detail I'd somehow missed before. One of the interior doors contained several deep dents surrounded by cracked wood. The marks weren't accidental. They looked exactly like repeated impacts, as though someone had struck the door over and over with a heavy object. For the first time, an unsettling thought crossed my mind. These weren't simply signs of an old farmhouse. They looked like evidence that something violent had happened there. That night, I decided I wasn't taking any chances. Since the bedroom had no lock, I dragged my suitcase in front of the door before climbing into bed. It wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone determined to enter, but if someone opened the door, I'd hear it. Around 2:30 in the morning, the sound came, a slow scraping across the hardwood floor. My suitcase. Moving. My eyes snapped open. The bedroom door stood halfway open. Moonlight spilled through the doorway. Standing there, perfectly still, was Elaine. She wore nothing but a pale nightgown. Her gray hair hung wildly around her face. Her mouth remained slightly open as she breathed heavily through it. Each breath sounded wet, uneven, almost animal-like. For several endless seconds, she simply stared at me. I forced myself to speak. Elaine. My own voice barely sounded like mine. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the room, one slow step, then another. Only then did I notice what hung loosely at her side. A kitchen knife. Its blade caught the moonlight as it swung gently beside her leg. Every ounce of warmth drained from my body. She continued approaching the bed with slow, deliberate movements. Her lips began moving. At first, I couldn't understand her. Then, the words became clear. You don't belong here. She whispered it again. You don't belong here. Closer. You don't belong here. Again. You don't belong here. The sentence repeated over and over with exactly the same empty tone as though she were reciting something she had memorized years earlier. She stopped beside my bed, close enough that I could hear every breath she took. The knife still hung loosely from her hand. She looked down at me without blinking. Time seemed to stop. Every instinct inside me screamed that if I remained silent for even one more second, something irreversible was about to happen. Summoning every bit of air in my lungs, I screamed Richard's name as loudly as I possibly could. The sound exploded through the quiet farmhouse. Elaine jerked violently. For the first time that night, something resembling fear flashed across her face. The instant I screamed Richard's name, Elaine jerked violently. For the first time since entering my room, emotion appeared on her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It looked almost like fear. She took one slow step backward, her cloudy eyes never leaving mine. The kitchen knife still dangled loosely at her side, reflecting a thin strip of moonlight. Then, without saying another word, she turned. The movement was unnaturally stiff. Every step she took looked mechanical, almost as if her body were following commands her mind no longer understood. She marched toward the doorway with rigid, deliberate movements. Her bare feet struck the wooden floor with slow, hollow thuds. She never looked back. When she reached the hallway, she pulled the bedroom door shut with surprising force. The slam echoed through the old farmhouse like a gunshot. Then came the footsteps. Steady, rhythmic, marching away down the hallway. I sat frozen on the bed, unable to move. My entire body shook uncontrollably. I didn't even realize I was still holding my breath until my lungs began to ache. Roughly 30 seconds later, I heard hurried footsteps climbing the staircase. Richard appeared in the doorway, breathing heavily. To my surprise, he looked more irritated than concerned. His hair was messy and his eyes were half closed, as though I had dragged him out of a deep sleep over something trivial. What happened? I could barely believe what I was hearing. Elaine was just in here. She had a knife. She walked all the way to my bed. She kept telling me I didn't belong here. As I spoke, I expected shock, panic, anything. Instead, Richard sighed. He rubbed one hand across his face. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he said, "She wouldn't hurt anybody. She isn't herself during the night." Those words immediately made something inside me snap. Until then, I had tried giving him the benefit of the doubt. I'd accepted every explanation. The wandering, the pacing, the whispering, the strange behavior. But now his wife had entered my bedroom carrying a knife while I slept. And somehow, he still treated it as though I were overreacting. Frustration quickly replaced fear. "I want to go home." The words came out louder than I intended. Richard glanced toward the hallway before answering. "It's 3 in the morning. Your mom's probably asleep. We'll talk about everything in the morning." His voice remained strangely calm. Too calm. Looking back, I realized that should have been another warning sign. If someone had broken into my room holding a knife, no reasonable person would suggest simply waiting until morning. I should have called my mother immediately. I know that now. But I was 16. Part of me didn't want to create unnecessary drama if this truly was the result of severe dementia. Another part still trusted Richard, at least a little. After he finally left, I dragged the heavy wooden dresser across the floor and wedged it tightly against the bedroom door. The scraping echoed throughout the upstairs hallway. For the remainder of the night, I never even attempted to sleep. I sat against the headboard with every light turned on, staring at the door until sunlight finally filtered through the curtains. Morning arrived, as though nothing had happened. The smell of pancakes drifted upstairs. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. Birds chirped outside. When I cautiously walked downstairs, Elaine greeted me with the exact same warm smile she had worn on my first day. "Good morning, sweetheart." She sounded cheerful, gentle, completely normal. If I hadn't lived through the previous night, I would never have believed she had stood over my bed holding a knife only a few hours earlier. She chatted while flipping pancakes onto my plate, asked whether I'd slept well, offered me more syrup. There wasn't the slightest hint that she remembered anything. The contrast was almost more disturbing than her nighttime behavior. Richard eventually pulled me aside after breakfast. He apologized. At least, he said the words, but it didn't feel sincere. It felt rehearsed, as though he delivered the same apology before. He admitted that Elaine's memory had been deteriorating more rapidly over the past year. That explanation sounded painfully inadequate after what I'd experienced. So I asked him directly, has she ever attacked anyone before? For the first time since I'd arrived, Richard hesitated. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Finally, he answered quietly. She became aggressive with one of her caregivers once. He quickly added, "It was handled." That sentence hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Handled, not denied. Not impossible. Handled. In that moment, I realized he had been hiding far more than simple memory problems. He had knowingly invited a teenager to stay inside a house with someone capable of becoming violent. I told him again that I wanted to leave immediately. This time he nodded. "I understand." Then came another excuse. "Your mom's working until late tonight. We'll finish one last job tomorrow morning. I'll drive you home afterward. And of course we'll pay you." I wasn't interested in the money anymore. I just wanted to leave. That afternoon, while Richard stood outside talking on his phone, I decided to start packing. I went looking for my backpack. Oddly enough, it wasn't where I'd left it. After checking upstairs, I eventually found it sitting inside the laundry room. The moment I picked it up, something caught my attention. A dark red stain covered the outer pocket. Fresh blood. Not a smear. Not a tiny spot. A noticeable stain. My heart immediately began racing. I carried the backpack outside. Richard. He turned around. When I showed him the stain, something changed in his expression. It lasted only a moment, but for the first time since arriving, I saw genuine anger flash across his face. He quickly took the backpack from my hands. "Oh, I accidentally cut myself earlier. I moved your bag in there while I cleaned it up." His explanation came almost too quickly. Then he forced a smile. "You're worrying too much." "Buy now." I wasn't buying any of it. "I'm calling my mom." Again, he urged me to calm down. Again, he insisted everything was under control. I ignored him. I carried my backpack upstairs and dialed my mother's number. The call failed. I tried again. Nothing. "No signal." Thinking texting might work, I sent her a message asking her to come get me immediately. The message never delivered. I walked back downstairs and asked Richard for the Wi-Fi password. He refused. Said he didn't remember it. Whether that was true or not, I couldn't tell. But standing there with no phone signal, no internet access, and no transportation, I experienced something far worse than fear. I felt trapped. Completely trapped. The nearest neighbors were far away. The property sat surrounded by dense woods. Walking home wasn't an option. I had no choice except to endure one final night. That evening I made a decision. I wasn't going to sleep. I left my shoes on, kept my jeans and jacket fully dressed. My backpack sat beside me. My phone remained in my hand. Before sunset, I once again shoved the dresser in front of the bedroom door. This time I pushed it even tighter against the frame. Around midnight, a knock came. Then Richard's voice. He asked me to move the dresser. "It blocks the exit. If there's a fire, you'll be trapped." I refused. Silence followed. Then, without warning, Richard shouted. It was the first time I'd ever heard him raise his voice. "Move the dresser." Now, the sudden anger caught me completely off guard. Not wanting another confrontation, I reluctantly shifted the dresser just enough for the door to open if necessary. As soon as he walked away, I pushed a chair against it instead. Then I waited. Every minute felt longer than the last. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the silence downstairs shattered. Elaine was screaming, not mumbling, not whispering, actually screaming. The words were impossible to understand. Furniture scraped across the floor. Richard repeatedly called her name, trying to calm her down. Then, crash. Glass exploded somewhere downstairs. The sound echoed through the farmhouse. A split second later came an enormous thud, followed immediately by Richard crying out in pain. It sounded as though something or someone had struck him. My pulse exploded. Instinctively, I crept toward my bedroom door. Very carefully, I eased it open just enough to see into the hallway. Darkness filled the second floor. Only a faint yellow glow from the downstairs hallway reached the staircase. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, I heard them. Footsteps. Fast, heavy. Charging up the staircase, getting closer with terrifying speed. One floorboard groaned. Then another. Then another. Whoever was coming upstairs was running straight toward my room. The instant I realized the footsteps were racing toward my room, instinct took over. I slammed the bedroom door shut with both hands and threw my full weight against it. The dresser I had reluctantly moved earlier scraped violently across the hardwood floor as I shoved it back into place. The sound was deafening. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear anything else. Then, the footsteps stopped. Right outside my door. For one terrifying second, everything became perfectly silent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked in place. Without warning, bang! Something crashed against the door with enough force to shake the entire frame. The dresser lurched several inches toward me. Another impact followed immediately. Bang! The doorknob exploded into motion, twisting back and forth so violently it looked as though it might snap off. Whoever stood outside wasn't trying to open the door anymore. They were trying to force their way through it. Then I heard Elaine's voice, only it barely sounded human. Gone was the gentle grandmother who smiled while serving pancakes. Gone was the soft-spoken woman who asked whether I wanted more coffee. The voice outside my bedroom was raw, harsh, filled with rage. She began repeating the same sentence over and over again. "You don't belong here." Another crash. "You don't belong here." The wood groaned. "You don't belong here." Each repetition became louder, more aggressive, more desperate. It sounded less like someone speaking, and more like someone reciting an obsession that had consumed every rational thought. The dresser shuddered again. I could hear wood splintering somewhere inside the frame. Then came a different sound. Metal. A heavy metallic clang slammed against the outside of the door. The entire room vibrated. A jagged crack appeared in the wood only a few feet above the doorknob. Another strike. This time a fist-sized splinter burst inward, scattering broken pieces of wood across the bedroom floor. I didn't need to see what she was holding. Whatever it was heavy enough to break through solid wood. My eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for another escape. There wasn't one. The walls, the closet, the tiny bathroom. Nowhere. Then I looked toward the window, the only exit left. Outside, moonlight illuminated the small porch roof beneath my bedroom window. It wasn't a safe jump, but it was infinitely safer than staying inside. Behind me, another deafening impact shook the door. The dresser shifted again. It wouldn't hold much longer. Somewhere downstairs, I could still hear Richard. His voice sounded weak now, pained. He was calling Elaine's name over and over, sometimes pleading, sometimes shouting. Whatever had happened downstairs, he had lost control, and if she broke through that door, no one would be able to stop her. I didn't hesitate any longer. I threw the window open. Cold night air rushed into the room. The old screen refused to come free. I kicked it once, twice. On the third kick, it tore loose and tumbled into the bushes below. Another violent crash shook the bedroom behind me. The door frame cracked loudly. I grabbed my backpack, climbed through the window, and carefully lowered myself onto the narrow porch roof. The shingles shifted beneath my weight. For one terrifying second, I thought I was going to slide straight off. Behind me, Elaine was still attacking the bedroom door. Each blow sounded closer than the last. I crawled to the roof's edge. There was no time to calculate the distance. No time to worry about broken bones. I jumped. The fall knocked every bit of air from my lungs. I crashed into a cluster of thick bushes before rolling onto the damp ground below. Pain shot through my ankle. For a moment, I could barely breathe. Then, another crash echoed from upstairs. Adrenaline overwhelmed the pain. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I sprinted across the yard toward the long gravel driveway without daring to look behind me. The night swallowed everything except the sound of my own footsteps. Halfway down the driveway, I heard the farmhouse door slam open. A voice screamed into the darkness. Elaine. I turned my head for only a fraction of a second. She stood on the front porch beneath the porch light. Her white nightgown fluttered in the wind. One hand gripped a long black fireplace poker. The metal reflected the light with every movement. Even from that distance, I could hear her shouting. The words were impossible to make out. Only the rage remained unmistakable. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. The gravel shifted beneath my shoes. My lungs burned. My chest felt ready to burst. The farmhouse slowly disappeared behind the trees as I reached the end of the driveway. Only after reaching the main road did I finally stop long enough to pull out my phone. This time, there was signal. My shaking fingers barely managed to dial 911. I struggled to explain where I was. The dispatcher kept telling me to slow down, to breathe, to repeat the address. Every second felt like an eternity. Roughly 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the empty road. 2 police vehicles arrived almost simultaneously, followed closely by an ambulance. Only then did I finally allow myself to believe I was safe. The officers approached the farmhouse, cautiously. Several minutes later, paramedics wheeled Richard outside on a stretcher. He was conscious, but barely. Blood ran down one side of his face from a deep cut near his scalp. His right wrist had been broken while trying to defend himself. He looked exhausted, defeated. Moments later, Elaine was escorted from the house by emergency medical personnel. She no longer appeared angry. Instead, she looked strangely calm, almost confused. She glanced around as though she had no idea why so many strangers surrounded her home. Watching her disappear into the ambulance was heartbreaking. Not because I doubted what had happened, but because it was painfully obvious that whatever illness had taken hold of her had completely consumed the woman she once was. The police eventually contacted my mother. She arrived as quickly as she could. The moment she stepped out of her car, she wrapped me in the tightest hug I'd ever received. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say. Everything had already gone far beyond words. Later, Richard spoke privately with my mother. For the first time, he finally told the truth. Elaine's condition had been deteriorating for months, far more severely than he had admitted. Doctors had repeatedly recommended long-term professional care. He refused. Not because he didn't understand the danger, Because he couldn't bear the guilt of placing his wife into a memory care facility after decades of marriage, he convinced himself he could manage on his own. He couldn't. Then came the confession that made my stomach turn. Before I ever arrived, Elaine had already attacked 2 professional caregivers, not once, twice. Richard had hidden that fact from us. Had my mother known even a fraction of that information, she never would have allowed me to stay there. When she heard the full story, anger flashed across her face unlike anything I'd ever seen. If Richard hadn't been an elderly man carrying the crushing weight of his own impossible situation, I honestly believe she might have slapped him. Even now, years later, I still replay those days in my mind. The sleepless nights, the footsteps, the whispering, the knife, the shattered bedroom door, the desperate jump from the window. What haunts me most isn't simply how close I came to serious harm. It's realizing how many opportunities I had to leave long before everything reached that point. Each warning sign appeared one at a time, small enough to explain away, easy enough to dismiss. A strange conversation, unsettling footsteps, a door opening in the middle of the night, a stare that lingered a little too long, a story that didn't quite make sense. Each incident taken alone seemed survivable, reasonable, explainable. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to see until it was almost too late. Looking back, I think that's one of the most dangerous parts of being human. We desperately want the world to remain ordinary. We search for innocent explanations because accepting the truth is frightening. We convince ourselves that everything is probably fine, that we're overreacting, that tomorrow will be normal again. Sometimes that optimism protects us from unnecessary fear, but sometimes it blinds us to genuine danger standing only a few steps away. And by the time reality finally forces us to open our eyes, escape may no longer be as simple as walking out the front door.